If you want to know how to learn Chinese, you've probably been told that your choice is one of the hardest languages in the world. People learning Chinese, the subject of today's case study, probably feel more frustrated than necessary every time this language receives such absurd accusations. And it's important to ask, what if it simply isn't true that Chinese is as difficult as people make it out to be? What if you had a simple way to learn even the most complex aspects of this language, including tones, characters, and still be able to rapidly memorize entire phrases within minutes? And what if you could do it all with minimum repetition, all in under an hour a day? And the best part, you can even take lots of breaks and still make progress. If all this sounds too good to be true, stick around. Everything I'm about to teach you is not only the best way to learn Mandarin, it's the most scientific way. Welcome to part 4 of our series on language learning, and now a detailed case study. Even if you're not learning Chinese, I suggest you take notes and apply the steps applicable to your language pronto. You got something to write with? Don't cheat yourself now. Taking notes is itself a great memory strategy. I'm trusting you here, so let's dive in. When I needed to learn as much spoken Mandarin as possible in less than 3 months, I looked to my friends Benny Lewis and Ollie Richards. Benny is famous for a few major rules. Speak from day one and create missions. Ollie also has some great rules. Choose no more than one textbook, one video course, one audio program, one teacher, at least to start. By following these simple principles, you start gaining traction immediately without overwhelming yourself. And although I'd studied languages a lot over the years, I knew that their simple rules were very important. How do you start speaking immediately? Once you have the best possible materials, you can read out loud, repeat from recordings, and be talking with a native speaker within a week or less when you follow all of the tips in this video. And if you like free content with simple but effective learning advice like this, please consider subscribing, and for the love of memory, hit that thumbs up to make sure the robots don't forget to send you more content from myself, Dr. Anthony Metivier, and our community gathered around magneticmerrymethod.com. I hope to see you over there too. The trick is in making sure you really do choose the best possible materials, but not in a way that causes endless delay. What are the best? Well, in this case, you're going to need to do some self-exploration and market research. No one can tell you exactly, and sometimes you have to experiment to find the best possible materials. Here's an example of choosing a great book for learning Mandarin. For me, I went directly to a Chinese character book. I read German, so I chose one in that language so I could practice laddering. This is a technique polyglots use to keep sharp in one language they've learned while stacking on another. If you can't do that yet, here are some things to consider. Look for a book that contains short lessons that help you achieve your goals. If you're not traveling, for example, look for something oriented more to Chinese vocabulary and phrases used in daily life. Something that contains links or downloads to audio or video components, and contains instructions on learning pinyin with clear instructions for each letter, and contains a vocabulary list, ideally organized by pinyin, in the back. In my case, I broke Ollie's law of choosing just one book because the character book included no phrases. So I added a second book of grammar that did include phrases. What about getting a dictionary? Well, by all means you can, and for that I suggest the Pleco app, ideally with the Outlier Linguistics add-on. I have a link in the description for Outlier Linguistics. I appreciate you using that if you get anything from them, as it helps me continue helping you through their affiliate program. I have taken all their courses myself and used their Pleco add-on and started as an authentic customer. So I'm not merely recommending them because we've become friends over time. I have benefited a great deal from their expertise and innovative contributions, and I'm happy to recommend them even if you don't use my affiliate link. It just helps the gears keep turning, and if you do, it's much appreciated. Now, let me give you an example of choosing a suitable video or audio program. Let's face it, the internet is packed with podcasts and videos to help you learn to speak Chinese, but you really should find just one and stick with it from beginning to end. The reason to focus on just one program at a time is to help your brain see the big picture. Later you can pick and choose from different sources, but even then you'll be best served by completing one course at a time thoroughly. Now note, the exception to the rule is if you really can't stand something about the format, but that should be pretty rare if you've done your research and read reviews from other successful language learners. When I started with Chinese, I went with Pimsleur. I'll talk about how to work with such a program in a moment, but the point for now is simply this. I made great progress with my Chinese not just because of the learning techniques we're discussing in this video. I also made progress because I did not constantly interrupt myself with endlessly searching for and trying other courses. Ollie's advice stuck with me, and I have a video all about how I use this principle here on this channel. It's from back in the day and looks a bit amateur, but I think you'll get a lot out of it all the same. I Identifying great teachers is trickier than finding books and courses, but one of my favorite sources is Italki. You can find speaking partners for free on the site, but I recommend you hire people, and here's why. When you hire a teacher, they are focused solely on you and your goals. You just have to make sure that they understand your goals and are a good fit for at least a weekly session over a 90-day period. And the only way to find out who will be a great teacher is to try holding sessions. I'll share some tips on maximizing your time with Mandarin teachers in a moment. My mentor, Tony Buzan, once told me that the rules will set you free. When learning a language on your own, you need to create your own rules. The ones I learned from Ollie about choosing just a few language materials and working with them thoroughly were golden for me. The Big Five is my fancy name for something called the levels of processing effect. Basically, it tells us that the more senses and processes we tap into, the more quickly we learn. The five that I rely upon heavily are reading, writing, speaking, listening, and memorization. The Big Five of learning utilizes this levels of processing effect, and it was identified by Lockhart and Craik back in 1972. And there are many ways to get all of these activities into just 15 to 20 minutes a day, ranging from activities with your teacher to using certain apps. For example, Bilingua app has some decent short stories. You'll see the Chinese characters and hear native speakers for most of the stories. Even better is Conversations by Ollie Richards, who I mentioned above. Not only do you hear native speakers engaged in dialogues real people would actually hold, but you also get vocabulary lists. Plus, Ollie teaches you a streamlined process that is much like the Big Five you just learned about. Again, I have an affiliate link for you in the description, so please consider using it if you check his programs out. We've talked about harnessing the power of limits when learning Chinese, and this is so important. And the best way to do this is through some self-analysis of what you want to be able to say. A lot of people get hung up on Chinese word frequency lists. Although they are useful, they are not and cannot be the holy grail of learning the language. You need to bring your own context to the game. For example, the first time I went to Beijing, there was no way I could have known in advance that I would want to talk about marriage in Mandarin. So there was no point in focusing on vocabulary or phrases related to this topic. My main mission was to get through at least 2 levels of Pimsleur for Mandarin and meet with a teacher online 2 to 3 times a week. To take another example, the last time I went to the zoo, I made it my mission to memorize 10 animals by their names in Chinese. What should your initial missions look like? Here are some examples of missions. Mission 1, gather your learning material and focus on the power of limits. Mission 2, schedule time on your calendar for when you're going to study the book and program you chose. Mission 3, schedule your meetings with teachers, ideally booking out as many in advance as possible after you've found a suitable match. Mission 4, learn the sounds of pinyin. Mission 5, keep following the programs but also identify things you want to say that aren't included in them to discuss with your teacher. Mission 6, identify themes related to your interests. And Mission 7, get started with characters. Now there are many more missions I could list, but let's focus on Mission 6 because it's really important. My friend Luca Lampariello talks a lot about finding topics you're interested in and then starting to translate them into your mother tongue. I'm big into memory, so naturally I chose a book on memory in Mandarin to start working with to expose myself to characters, grammar, and a general sense of how the written language works. I record every session with language learning teachers I hold. Why? Because that way I can focus on the moment and not worry about losing any words or phrases from the session. I prefer a software called ScreenFlow for recording these sessions, and I have the textbook or teaching materials on the screen and my teacher on Skype. Then whenever I want, I can go back through the lesson and make notes and put words and phrases into my Memory Palace network for Chinese. Now note, the first mission I brought to the teacher was to go through lesson 1 of the Pimsleur program, and some of the vocabulary I picked up from the Chinese character book I decided upon. To organize words and phrases, you can write them in a notebook, place them on index cards, memorize them directly, and then have flashcards as mnemonic devices for Chinese characters. In all cases, I suggest that during your first session, you work strictly with pinyin and oral Chinese. Save the characters for later. Pinyin is tricky because there are at least 4 kinds you might come across, often in the same day. None is better than the other, and there's no escaping the fact that it is frustrating not to have a standard. However, your best path to progress is to pick one and learn it. Many good Chinese primers come with pull-out pinyin charts. I suggest using a Memory Palace to rapidly memorize the sounds. Because pronunciation is so key to success in being understood in Chinese, make sure that you work with a native speaker. As my friends from Outlier Linguistics say, over-practice your pronunciation until it's possible to fail. If you want to know how to learn Chinese fast, nearly everyone agrees that mnemonics are your best bet. There's nothing new about this, and I even visited the grave of a famous language learner from Italy in Beijing named Matteo Ricci. He used mnemonics back in the 16th century and even wrote a book about how to do it in Chinese that is still in circulation today. Visiting the Beijing tomb of a great Chinese learner who used memory techniques like Matteo Ricci was a highlight of my life. Now, there are a number of mnemonics for learning Chinese that will help you. There's the memory palace, magnetic imagery, which is scientifically known as elaborative encoding, and recall rehearsal. Now, in brief, to use a memory palace involves placing unusual images along a journey you've mentally recreated. For example, I memorized a song in Chinese very quickly. 我爱你有多深，我爱你要几分，我的情也真，我的爱也真，月亮代表我的心。I used the apartment you see me in to place magnetic imagery in linear lines throughout the apartment. After I memorized this song, I added a poem to that same kitchen. Now, people often ask about how to use cluttered and untidy memory palaces. Well, I suggest finding spots on walls. Since so many Chinese phrases are quite short, you can get a lot memorized in small places. With practice, you can transform every home and building you're familiar with into memory palaces that help you rapidly memorize all the Chinese vocabulary and phrases you create time for. And then the next step is to use the memory palace for recall rehearsal. Now, remember when I told you in the beginning about reducing the amount of repetition when getting Chinese into long-term memory? The memory palace technique is how. Basically, you use the memory palace to harness a few aspects of memory called primacy effect, recency effect, serial positioning effect, and the von Restorff effect. The way to get really good at this powerful memory approach is to have a strong memory palace training routine. That way you can get to the point where you memorize entire lines of Chinese within minutes, sometimes seconds. I demonstrated this skill live with Chinese lyrics on a live stream, and the replay with its triumphant ending is still available on this channel. I actually wasn't sure I could do it, but I simply used the magnetic memory method, and it worked out just fine. If you want to use mnemonics as I do to memorize Chinese quickly, I suggest making it easy on yourself in the beginning. Memorize exactly what you learn in the program and book you chose. Ease of using the techniques is yet another reason to choose well and go through your resources thoroughly. I did this with Pimsleur and learned a lot of basic Chinese very quickly just by listening to the program, writing out the pinyin by hand, and then memorizing each line in a memory palace. Likewise, when you record your sessions with Chinese teachers, you are essentially giving yourself a program to extract information from and memorize. And because you are working based on missions, you'll proceed very quickly and in a way that is better than any course or book on its own can provide. Learning the tones is really important, and it is still my major weak point. To help myself out, I started to apply an additional technique called the major method. This mnemonic device lets you add a secondary image so you can remember tones on top of memorizing the basic sound and the meaning of a word or phrase. There are 4 tones, though you will sometimes find people saying there are 5 or even 6 of them. To my ear, there are only 4, and most people seem to work with that number. As with pinyin, you'll see the tones represented in different ways. For example, you might see ma, le, kong, yu. A simple way to memorize the symbols added above the letters is with a friend or animal. For example, just to memorize these, imagine a kangaroo punching straight forward for the first tone, ma. Imagine a kangaroo jumping up for the second tone, le. Imagine a kangaroo hitting the ground hard enough to dent it for the third tone, kong. Imagine a kangaroo breaking a board in 2 for the 4th tone, yu. Now, you'll rarely see single-syllable words as in the examples I just gave outside of textbooks. Usually Chinese words come in syllabic pairs. For example, hen, hao. When you use the major method, you can instantly create an image for 2-digit numbers. So, if you've memorized hen, hao, and you want to remember the correct tones, you can think of your image for 23. If the core image for the word is a hen asking a garden hoe how to use it, then the image to remind you that you need to use the tones 2 and 3 would be something like a Vietnam vet. This works because 2 is always connected with an N and 3 is always associated with an M. Sound too complex? Maybe in the beginning it will be, but it's an incredibly powerful tool if you devote yourself to learning it. And since there are tones to learn for pretty much each and every word in Chinese, I recommend that you do. Again, if you're following along so far, you're going to have plenty of speaking opportunities, and you'll have recordings of yourself speaking with your teacher. Listening back to your own voice can be a painful experience, but soon you'll get used to it and develop critical distance. Listening objectively and comparing your voice to native speakers will help you correct. I was given the advice to focus mostly on pinyin and oral Chinese for at least a year. Although I like drawing and did a small amount of work with my character book, which I mostly used for the word list in the back, I mostly followed this advice. Now, why delay the writing system for so long? Well, the advice isn't going to be right for everyone, but let's face it, when learning Chinese, we're asking the brain to handle a ton of information. Characters, tones and tone shifts, core sounds for words and phrases, meanings and grammar. When exactly the time comes up to add Chinese characters is up to you. There is no perfect time, but I do think it makes sense to delay it so you can focus just on pinyin and sounds to gain a solid footing and start recognizing the Chinese you hear. When it comes time to memorize the characters, you'll need to consider learning stroke order. This can be done using a memory palace by imagining the stroke order on imaginary walls. For example, you can have 2 rooms in a memory palace, and on 7 of the walls place mental associations that help you remember that characters are generally constructed top to bottom, left to right when radicals are in play, and horizontal first, vertical second, and that you close the frames before filling them and close the frames last. And anytime a line spans the entire character, you draw that last. Now personally, I just do my best and practice improving over time. Remember, the focus is on missions. If you're never going to write, maybe you should choose to focus purely on reading characters instead. This is where Pleco with the Outlier Linguistics add-on is great because it will show you the early origins of the character, which are often filled with pictorial clues that help you build your recall even without mnemonics. Sometimes I don't feel like using mnemonics, at least not right away. That's why I draw the images sometimes. In this case, I made a simple drawing of the red band on a slingshot, a gong, and some sheep going to work to remember the word for office in Mandarin. 办公室. Later, I transported this image into a memory palace for other words with recall rehearsal. You can also use mind mapping to learn Chinese. I do this with tougher characters or to create variety as I learn. It helps me stack on more mnemonics faster and in a way that includes more information about the sound, meaning, tones, and characters. This method takes a bit more time in the beginning, but the more you practice, the faster you'll get. In the mind map example given on the screen, you can see how I've used the major method to remember the tones and laddering by incorporating some German. If you know multiple memory techniques and multiple languages, use them. As you proceed along your Chinese learning journey, you're going to find that some things get easier. When that happens, you'll do yourself little or no good by repeating things that no longer challenge you. The flip side of the coin is that you don't want to get ambitious and skip so far ahead that you frustrate yourself. That just leads to giving up or taking unusually long pauses. Now, as you'll see, taking some breaks is actually good, but not for too long. And since everyone's journey is different, there is no perfect example. But let's say that you've gotten good at ordering your favorite foods at a restaurant. You can make things more challenging by talking about world events. But if you find that is too challenging, scale back. Talk about what you did yesterday instead, and pepper in learning a few words about watching the news as you gradually build up to talking about its content. Although the internet has allowed us to meet Chinese native speakers and teachers from around the world, the miracle of technology does have some deficits. You don't have the full benefit of proxemics, for example, which is the full range of gestures and hearing sounds unmediated by technology. I was able to review and improve my pronunciation in Guilin, China while teaching memory techniques for 3 days in this beautiful part of China. And a great way to start to learn faster with a native speaker is to sit at a table and discuss the pictures in a magazine. By this time, you should know some phrases like "what's this called?" and you don't have to make your first conversation any fancier than that. Just sit with your native speaker and keep asking the question, listening to what they say. You can do a version of this online with scans from magazines you bring to your learning lessons. But there's something magical about sitting with a native speaker whenever you can. Do this as often as possible. The temptation to sign up for more courses will be ongoing. Eventually you should, taking care to schedule out your study sessions and complete each from beginning to end. Here's some of my favorites that I've completed: Pimsleur Mandarin, Mandarin HQ, Outlier Linguistics, and Mandarin Corner. I also learn a ton from Instagram teachers like Chilling Chinese, Chels Teaches Chinese, Miss Tan Mandarin, and Mandarin HQ. Each of these teachers makes it fun and easy to hear and read Chinese every single day. But don't forget to write out what you learn, speak it yourself, and memorize the information using the Big Five. Language learning requires tons of input, but you've also got to add output in order to learn. This step is not strictly necessary, but I'm glad that I registered for a course with the Confucius Institute in Brisbane. It was my first in-person class. They started with an intake test, and I was surprised and delighted when they fast-tracked me to level 3 based on the skills I showed up with, based purely on self-study tips that you've learned today. What I loved about the course includes things you might want to look out for yourself. A very small class size, the teacher used English only and only as a last resort, characters were used with a minimum of pinyin, and it made the discipline of sticking with one textbook easier. It was also fun to use the class itself as a memory palace. The only thing that I didn't like is that the classes took place at night. Other than that, it really helped accelerate my Chinese abilities, though I'm very glad that I waited to take the course and studied on my own in the beginning. When learning Chinese, you want to develop the habit of self-talk in the language. For example, when you're planning your day, do it in Chinese. If you find that you don't know the word for post office or certain grocery items, now you have a mini mission. This habit starts small in the beginning when you only have a few words, but start doing it anyway. It's a form of active recall, and it helps you keep track of where you have holes in your fluency. If you don't do this kind of self-talk in Chinese, you lose out on a lot of self-analysis that helps you craft better Chinese learning mission. Believe it or not, it's a good thing to take a week off from time to time. There's no specific pattern to follow, but let's say that a good rule of thumb is 5 weeks on and 1 week off. The trick is in scheduling these breaks so they're not random or accidental, and you have a path for getting yourself back on the horse. Taking breaks works because it allows your brain to percolate the information you focus so hard on absorbing. This effect is sometimes called diffuse thinking. You can also get it by taking ample breaks during your study phases. For example, rather than cramming for an hour, you might find you learn and retain more when you work in 15-minute blasts. Explore different patterns and journal what works for you so you can see and make use of the trends that emerge. Learning a language like Chinese isn't that much different than any other. You just need to set some rules and then practice consistently. Remember how I told you my mentor, Tony Buzan, said the rules will set you free? I was delighted to find an entire shelf of my mentor's book in Chinese translation in Beijing. Well, Tony said that to me when I saw him just before taking my first trip to China. I thought a lot about what being free to learn faster and remember more really means, and here's what I've come up with. Frequent practice in a state of relaxation and a spirit of experimentation within well-defined limits will keep you endlessly entertained. Follow the rules in this video and you'll be free to speak Chinese as fluently as you wish in no time at all. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and if you're ready to add a memory palace strategy to how you're learning Chinese or any other language, please watch our playlist series on Mind Palace Training Secrets next.